The grand auditorium of Nexus Prime University buzzed with the kind of intellectual arrogance that only comes from beings who believe they have conquered the universe through a superior evolution. Holographic displays flickered to life above the amphitheater, casting eerie shadows across hundreds of alien faces. Each species represented here considered themselves the pinnacle of civilized development. Professor Kell'tar adjusted his ceremonial teaching robes, the fabric shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that marked his status as a distinguished fellow of xenobiology. His four eyes swept across the audience with the practiced condescension of someone who had spent decades explaining obvious truths to inferior minds. The Zephyrian's translucent skin pulsed with pride as he activated his neural interface, syncing with the university's most advanced holographic projection system. Esteemed colleagues, students, and guests, Kell'tar began, his voice carrying that particular tone academics use when they believe they are about to bestow wisdom upon the unworthy. The pause before guests was deliberate, a subtle reminder that not everyone present belonged to their elevated circles of learning. In the back row, tucked between a towering crystalloid engineer and a cluster of chattering Velkari botanists, sat what appeared to be the most unremarkable being in the entire auditorium. Maya Torres looked exactly like what the galactic community expected from humans, small, soft, and utterly harmless. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were the standard-issue civilian garments favored by exchange students, and her expression carried that slightly overwhelmed look that most species wore when attending their first prestigious academic lecture. She pulled out an old-fashioned paper notebook, how charmingly primitive, and began taking notes with an actual writing implement. Several nearby aliens exchanged amused glances. How delightfully backward these humans were, still using physical tools when proper beings had evolved past such crude necessities millennia ago. Today, Professor Kell'tar announced, his voice rising with theatrical flourish, we shall examine one of the most fascinating aspects of galactic evolution, the phenomenon of Deathworld predators, and how civilized species have transcended such barbaric survival mechanisms. The audience settled into comfortable smugness, ready to have their superiority confirmed once again. After all, they were the enlightened ones, the beings who had risen above the crude violence of their ancestors through superior intellect and social development. Maya Torres continued taking notes, her pen moving steadily across the paper. If anyone had bothered to look closely, which of course none of them did, they might have noticed that her handwriting was unusually neat, her observations remarkably detailed. And her eyes held the kind of quiet alertness that suggested she was recording far more than simple academic curiosity would require. But why would anyone pay attention to a harmless human? Professor Kell'tar gestured dramatically, and the holographic display erupted into a three-dimensional menagerie of nightmares. The first creature to materialize was a writhing mass of tentacles and gnashing teeth from the volcanic world of Pyraxis 7, the infamous magma render, whose crystalline exoskeleton could withstand temperatures that would vaporize most metals. Observe, if you will, the primitive brutality of this specimen, Kell'tar intoned, his voice dripping with the kind of academic superiority that made actual scientists want to throw things. The magma render represents everything our civilized species have evolved beyond: mindless aggression, territorial violence, and a complete inability to negotiate peaceful coexistence. The audience murmured appreciative agreement, their various appendages rustling with self-congratulatory satisfaction. A trio of hegemony officials in the third row exchanged knowing looks. Clearly, they had transcended such barbarism through their superior diplomatic protocols and trade agreements. Maya Torres raised an eyebrow at this assessment, her pen pausing momentarily over her notebook. Apparently, the professor had never heard of corporate warfare or the hegemony's rather creative approach to negotiating mining rights with less technologically advanced worlds. The hologram shifted, revealing a sleek, serpentine creature with iridescent scales that seemed to shift through impossible colors. The Velkari mindworm. Kell'tar, announced with theatrical flourish, demonstrates another example of evolution's failures. This parasite controls its host's neural pathways, forcing them to act against their own survival instincts. Truly, a disgusting display of nature's inability to develop proper consensual relationships. Several Velkari in the audience clicked their mandibles in vigorous agreement, apparently missing the irony that their own species had perfected the art of psychological manipulation through pheromone-based suggestion techniques. Maya's lips twitched slightly. She had studied Velkari diplomatic methods extensively, and their definition of consensual was rather flexible when it came to trade negotiations. Now, witness the razor swarm of Kethmori Prime. The professor continued, conjuring thousands of metallic insects that moved in perfect synchronized formations. These creatures operate on pure instinct, lacking the individual consciousness that marks truly evolved beings. They sacrifice themselves mindlessly for the collective, showing no regard for personal advancement or intellectual growth. The irony was lost on the Kethmori delegation, who sat in their characteristic formation, perfectly aligned, thinking in perfect harmony, and apparently seeing no contradiction between condemning hive mind behavior while practicing it themselves. Maya made a small notation in her notebook, something that looked suspiciously like a tactical assessment of group coordination capabilities. Each of these specimens, Kell'tar proclaimed, warming to his theme, represents the kind of savage, thinking violence that civilized beings have left behind through the power of advanced reasoning, diplomatic sophistication, and technological superiority. A murmur of smug approval rippled through the audience. Yes, they were certainly superior to such crude survival mechanisms. They had evolved beyond violence through their enlightened approaches to conflict resolution, like economic warfare, technological suppression, and the occasional strategic deployment of peacekeeping forces to maintain galactic stability. Maya's expression grew more amused with each pronouncement. She had spent the last 6 months observing these civilized species conduct their affairs, and their definition of evolved beyond violence was certainly creative. The Zephyrians might not have claws, but their financial manipulation techniques could destroy entire planetary economies. The Velkari preferred subtle coercion to direct confrontation, but the end result was often the same. And the Kethmori concept of collective harmony had a remarkable tendency to require the assimilation of inconvenient independent thinkers. What separates us from these primitive predators? The professor continued, his 4 eyes gleaming with intellectual pride, is our capacity for rational thought, our ability to solve conflicts through superior mental faculties rather than brute force, and our commitment to advancing civilization through peaceful cooperation. At this point, Maya had to bite her lip to keep from laughing out loud. The professor's definition of peaceful cooperation apparently included the recent Zephyrian blockade of 3 independent systems, the Velkari Cultural Exchange program that seemed remarkably similar to forced indoctrination, and the Kethmori expansion initiative that had somehow resulted in the complete disappearance of 17 minor species who had simply been integrated into the collective. She continued taking notes, her observations growing more detailed with each passing minute. And now Professor Kell'tar announced with the kind of dramatic pause that suggested he was about to deliver his masterpiece. And we come to perhaps the most amusing example of evolutionary failure in the known galaxy, the so-called predators of the primitive world designated as Earth. The holographic display shifted, and suddenly the auditorium was filled with the image of a massive African lion, its mane flowing as it stalked across digital grasslands. The creature's muscles rippled beneath golden fur, and its amber eyes held the kind of focused intensity that had kept prey animals awake at night for millions of years. Behold, Kell'tar said with barely contained amusement, the apex predator of a backwater world that barely qualifies as a Class M Deathworld. This specimen relies entirely on brute force and primitive hunting techniques. No advanced technology, no telepathic abilities, no energy manipulation. Simply crude physical violence. Several aliens in the front rows chittered with laughter. How delightfully primitive indeed. The crystalloid engineer next to Maya made a sound that might have been a snort if crystalloids had possessed the necessary biological equipment for snorting. Maya's pen stopped moving. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched the holographic lion freeze mid-stride, reduced to nothing more than an academic curiosity for Beings who had apparently never experienced the particular terror of being hunted by something that had perfected the art of killing over evolutionary timescales. The display changed again, showing a great white shark cutting through dark waters with the kind of fluid precision that had remained unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. This aquatic specimen, the professor continued, demonstrates the absolute limitations of biological evolution. No cognitive development, no social structure, no technological advancement, merely an eating machine that has remained static for eons. A Valkyrie in the middle section made a dismissive clicking sound. How fortunate for us that we evolved beyond such simple-minded approaches to resource acquisition, she remarked to her companion, apparently forgetting that Valkyrie hunting parties were renowned throughout 3 sectors for their efficiency in tracking down defaulted debtors. Maya's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had grown up swimming in waters where great whites were a constant presence, had learned to read their movements, understand their behavior, and respect their perfect adaptation to their environment. Calling them simple-minded demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of what intelligence actually meant in a survival context. The hologram shifted once more, revealing a massive grizzly bear rearing up on its hind legs, claws extended and mouth open in a silent roar. And here we see perhaps the most pathetic example, Kell'tar proclaimed with obvious glee. A creature so poorly designed that it must resort to intimidation displays and random violence. No strategic thinking, no tactical coordination, no ability to plan beyond its immediate needs. This time Maya actually snorted quietly, a sound that went unnoticed by everyone except the crystalloid beside her, who turned one of his optical sensors in her direction with mild curiosity. Apparently the professor had never studied bear behavior, never learned about their complex social structures, their problem-solving abilities, or their capacity for long-term planning and memory. But these primitive beasts pale in comparison to the most amusing evolutionary accident of all, the professor announced, his voice rising with theatrical triumph. The species that somehow stumbled their way off this backwards planet and into galactic society, humans themselves. The audience erupted in polite laughter, the kind of refined amusement that civilized beings used when contemplating the antics of inferior species. Maya's expression grew very, very still. Humans! Humans! Kell'tar continued, clearly enjoying himself. Represent perhaps the most remarkable example of how random chance can occasionally produce results that superficially resemble intelligence. These barely evolved primates somehow managed to develop rudimentary technology through sheer accident, allowing them to briefly participate in galactic civilization despite their obvious biological limitations. More laughter rippled through the audience. Maya's knuckles went white as she gripped her pen. Consider the evidence, the professor said, warming to his theme. Humans are physically weak, no natural armor, no claws, no enhanced sensory capabilities. They are emotionally unstable, prone to irrational behavior, and completely dependent on primitive pack bonding for psychological survival. Their lifespans are laughably short, their reproductive rate inefficient, and their cognitive processes are hampered by obsolete survival instincts that have no place in civilized society. A hegemony official raised one of his tentacles. Professor, are we to understand that humans pose no significant threat to established galactic order? Precisely. Kell'tar beamed, his translucent skin practically glowing with academic pride. Humans are essentially harmless curiosities, interesting to study from an anthropological perspective, but utterly incapable of matching the sophisticated approaches to conflict resolution that characterize truly evolved species. The laughter grew louder. Several aliens turned to look at Maya with barely concealed amusement, as if expecting her to provide some sort of entertaining response to this analysis of her species' inadequacies. Maya Torres sat perfectly still, her dark eyes fixed on the professor with the kind of focused attention that a certain African predator might have recognized. Her pen had stopped moving entirely, but her mind was working at a pace that would have impressed even the Keth Mori collective processing systems. The primitive pack animal was beginning to show her teeth. Maya Torres raised her hand with the kind of polite, academic gesture that professors everywhere had learned to dread, though Professor Kell'tar was apparently too intoxicated by his own brilliance to recognize the warning signs. "Yes," he said with the tone of someone prepared to indulge a student's misguided curiosity. "You have a question about the material?" "Actually, yes," Maya replied, her voice carrying the perfectly modulated courtesy that somehow managed to sound more dangerous than outright hostility. "I was wondering if your research included any analysis of persistence hunting techniques?" Kell'tar blinked his four eyes in sequence, a sign of confusion among Zephyrians. "Persistence hunting? I'm afraid I'm not familiar with that particular primitive behavior." "Oh," Maya said, her tone suggesting mild surprise at this gap in the professor's expertise. "It's a hunting method where the predator doesn't rely on speed or strength, but rather on the ability to maintain pursuit over extended periods until the prey collapses from exhaustion. Humans were particularly effective at this approach. They could literally run their prey to death over distances of 20, 30, sometimes 50 kilometers. A ripple of unease passed through the audience. The Velkari delegate who had been so amused earlier shifted uncomfortably in her seat. 50 kilometers of sustained pursuit was unsettling to contemplate. "Well," Kell'tar stammered, that's merely an extension of the brutish behavior I was describing. Completely uncivilized, really." "Of course," Maya agreed pleasantly. "I was also curious about your analysis of human combat psychology. Did your research cover their approach to warfare and conflict resolution?" The professor's skin began to lose some of its confident glow. "Combat psychology? My dear student, I hardly think the random violence of primitive species qualifies as a subject worthy of serious academic study." "Interesting perspective," Maya mused, making another note in her little book. "Because I've been reading some fascinating papers about human tactical thinking. Apparently they have this concept called acceptable losses. They can calculate exactly how many of their own people they're willing to sacrifice to achieve a strategic objective. Most species find that kind of coldly rational approach to their own mortality rather disturbing." Several aliens in the front rows exchanged glances. The Keth-Mori delegation, despite their collective consciousness, seemed to experience something resembling individual discomfort at this observation. "Furthermore," Maya continued, her voice still maintaining that helpful student-like tone, "I came across some references to something called mutually assured destruction. It's a strategic doctrine where humans would threaten to destroy themselves and their enemies simultaneously if attacked. They apparently spent decades living under the constant threat of species-wide extinction and just adapted to it as a normal part of daily life." Professor Kell'tar's translucent skin had begun to take on a distinctly greenish tinge. These are aberrant examples of psychological dysfunction, not evidence of sophisticated strategic thinking." "Oh, absolutely," Maya nodded enthusiastically. "Though I did find it curious that this psychologically dysfunctional species managed to develop effective countermeasures against most of the common galactic pacification and techniques. For instance, they seem remarkably resistant to telepathic influence. Something about their emotional instability creating what they call mental static that interferes with psychic manipulation." The Velkari delegate was now actively uncomfortable, her mandibles clicking in a pattern that suggested significant anxiety. Velkari pacification techniques relied heavily on telepathic suggestion and their pack bonding behavior. Maya continued thoughtfully, "produces some rather unexpected results under stress. Instead of becoming more vulnerable, they actually become more dangerous when their group members are threatened. There are documented cases of individual humans taking on overwhelming odds to protect their companions, displaying complete disregard for personal survival." "Young lady," Professor Kell'tar interrupted, his voice rising slightly, "I hardly think these random anecdotes contradict the clear scientific evidence of human inferiority." Maya looked up from her notebook with an expression of innocent curiosity. "Oh, I'm not contradicting anything, Professor. I'm just wondering if perhaps there might be aspects of human behavior that weren't included in your analysis. After all, any species that managed to survive on a death world and eventually achieve interstellar travel must have developed some rather effective survival strategies, don't you think? The auditorium had grown very quiet. Even the most arrogant aliens were beginning to sense that something had shifted in the academic atmosphere. Maya Torres closed her notebook with a soft snap that somehow carried the weight of a closing trap, and stood up. The movement was fluid, economical, and possessed the kind of controlled grace that predators displayed when they had finally decided to stop playing with their food. "I apologize, Professor Kell'tar," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the now silent auditorium. "I should have introduced myself properly at the beginning of your lecture. I'm Dr. Maya Torres, and I'm not actually here as an exchange student." The professor's four eyes widened in sequence, a biological response that would have been comical under different circumstances. Not a student? Then what? "I'm a comparative combat specialist," Maya continued pleasantly, as if she were discussing the weather rather than dropping a tactical nuclear weapon into the middle of an academic lecture. "My particular area of expertise is analyzing the combat methodologies of different species and identifying potential strategic applications. You might say it's my hobby." The word hobby hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Several aliens in the front rows had begun to lean away from her, their various survival instincts finally overriding their intellectual arrogance. "You see," Maya continued, beginning to pace slowly along her row with the measured steps of someone conducting a briefing, "I've spent the last 6 months attending lectures just like this one. Fascinating stuff, really. I've learned so much about how different species perceive themselves, their capabilities, and their approach to conflict resolution." Professor Kell'tar's translucent skin had now achieved a sickly yellow-green color that suggested his body was flooding with stress hormones. I don't understand what you're implying." "Oh, I'm not implying anything," Maya said with a smile that would have made that holographic lion proud. "I'm stating facts. For instance, did you know that humans developed persistence hunting not because they were too stupid to find better methods, but because it was the most energy-efficient way to take down prey that was faster and stronger than they were?" She paused, letting that sink in. The technique required them to track their target for hours or days, reading behavioral patterns, predicting movement, and maintaining pursuit until the prey's superior physical capabilities became irrelevant. It was less about running and more about thinking. The crystalloid engineer beside her abandoned his seat entirely, his optical sensors focused on Maya with the kind of attention normally reserved for potential threats. His species had evolved from prey animals, and every instinct he possessed was suddenly screaming warnings. "And those emotional instabilities you mentioned," Maya continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the growing tension in the room. "They're not bugs in the system, Professor. They're features. Human anger, for example, triggers a cascade of biochemical changes that increase pain tolerance, enhance reaction speed, and suppress the normal psychological barriers that prevent violence." She gestured toward the holographic display, which still showed the frozen image of the grizzly bear. "You called that intimidation display pathetic, but you fundamentally misunderstood its purpose. It wasn't about scaring prey, it was about giving potential threats one last chance to avoid a fight. Because once a bear decides to kill something, it doesn't stop until the threat is eliminated or it's dead. Humans work the same way, except they can plan their violence days, weeks, or years in advance." Professor Kell'tar made a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at academic rebuttal, but Maya was just getting started. "The pack bonding you dismissed as psychological weakness." She smiled again, and this time several aliens in the audience made involuntary sounds of distress. "It creates a multiplier effect. Individual humans become exponentially more dangerous when they're protecting their group. They'll engage in behaviors that would be classified as temporary insanity by most species standards, charging superior forces, accepting certain death to buy time for their companions, continuing to fight with injuries that should have incapacitated them." The Velkari delegate was now actively trembling, her sophisticated pheromone manipulation techniques utterly useless against a species that had evolved to function effectively under extreme stress. "But the most interesting thing about humans," Maya said, her voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow made her words more terrifying, is how they approach the concept of civilized behavior. You assumed that achieving technological advancement meant abandoning violence. But humans simply industrialized it. They created warfare as a science, turned killing into an art form, and developed the capacity to eliminate entire planets while maintaining the illusion of civilized discourse. She looked directly at the professor, who was now visibly shaking. You want to know what separates humans from those primitive predators you showed us? Those animals kill for food, territory, or self-defense. Humans kill for ideas. They'll destroy themselves and everything around them for abstract concepts like honor, freedom, or revenge. They're the only species in known galactic history to seriously contemplate the complete annihilation of their own planet rather than submit to conquest. The auditorium was completely silent now, filled with the kind of absolute quiet that preceded either flight or violence. Maya Torres stood in the center of it all, no longer the harmless exchange student but something far more dangerous, yet a predator who had been studying them while pretending to be prey. So tell me, Professor, she said softly, exactly which one of us is the primitive savage? The silence stretched for several heartbeats before Maya reached into her jacket and withdrew a small device that looked suspiciously unlike standard civilian equipment. The metallic surface bore markings that several military-trained aliens in the audience recognized with growing horror. I should probably clarify my actual position here, Maya said, her entire demeanor shifting from academic curiosity to professional competence. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Maya Torres, Human Strategic Intelligence Corps, currently assigned to the Galactic Assessment Division. My official title is Senior Xenological Threat Analyst. Professor Kell'tar's legs gave out, and he collapsed into his lecture podium chair with a sound like deflating balloon. Threat Analyst? That's correct, Maya confirmed, activating the device with a casual gesture. Holographic displays began materializing around her, not the university's teaching system, but something far more sophisticated and decidedly military in origin. I've been conducting a comprehensive evaluation of galactic defensive capabilities, strategic thinking patterns, and potential vulnerability assessments for the past 6 months. The first hologram showed detailed schematics of the university's security systems, complete with highlighted weaknesses and suggested infiltration routes. For instance, your campus security relies entirely on the assumption that threats will be external and obvious. A single individual with appropriate credentials can access virtually any facility without triggering meaningful oversight. A hegemony security chief in the third row made a choking sound as he recognized his own security protocols being dissected with clinical precision. Your species' approaches to information security are particularly fascinating, Maya continued, calling up another display that showed communication intercepts, meeting recordings, and what appeared to be classified diplomatic correspondence. Most of you assume that primitive humans lack the technical sophistication to monitor your activities. This assumption has proven remarkably useful for intelligence gathering. The Valkyrie delegate was now hyperventilating, her sophisticated pheromone systems completely overwhelmed by panic. But Maya had been in their private strategy sessions, their classified briefings, their supposedly secure communications. The crystalloid engineering principles, Maya said, highlighting another set of schematics, are absolutely brilliant for creating efficient, mathematically perfect structures. Unfortunately, mathematical perfection tends to create predictable failure points that can be exploited with relatively simple kinetic solutions. She gestured toward the crystalloid engineer, who had apparently achieved some sort of optical shutdown state that might have been the equivalent of fainting. 3 kilograms of properly placed explosives could destabilize your primary habitat domes on 7 different worlds simultaneously. The Keth Mori collective consciousness, and Maya continued mercilessly, presents unique opportunities for disruption. Since your entire species shares linked decision-making processes, but introducing specific psychological triggers at key nodes can create cascade failures across your entire population network. The Keth Mori delegation had gone completely silent, their perfect unity shattered by the realization that their greatest strength was also their most catastrophic weakness. and the Zephyrian financial networks. Maya said, turning to face Professor Kell'tar directly, are sophisticated enough to control galactic economies. But they're entirely dependent on trust-based verification systems. A species with sufficient disregard for economic stability could collapse your entire monetary structure in approximately 72 hours. Professor Kell'tar was now openly weeping, his translucent skin cycling through colors that suggested complete psychological breakdown. You've been studying us like laboratory specimens." "Exactly like laboratory specimens," Maya confirmed with professional satisfaction. "The beauty of being underestimated is that nobody bothers to hide their actual capabilities. You've all been so busy explaining how primitive and harmless humans are that you've essentially provided detailed tactical briefings on your own strategic limitations." She deactivated her displays and returned the device to her jacket, her movements precise and economical. "The irony, of course, is that you were absolutely correct about one thing, Professor. Humans are predators. We're just not the kind you were expecting." Maya's smile had transformed entirely now, carrying none of the polite academic courtesy she had displayed earlier. This was the expression of someone who had spent months studying potential prey and had finally decided to reveal exactly how thoroughly she understood their weaknesses. "We don't hunt with claws or fangs or energy weapons," she said quietly. "We hunt with patience, planning, and the willingness to spend years learning everything about our targets before they even realize they're being stalked." The auditorium's main entrance opened with a soft hiss, and a figure in crisp military dress uniform walked in with the kind of casual confidence that suggested he owned whatever space he happened to occupy. Captain Rex Montana was tall even by human standards, and his presence seemed to fill the entire room, despite his relaxed demeanor. "Sorry I'm late, Colonel Torres," he said cheerfully, as if interrupting a prestigious academic lecture was perfectly normal behavior. "Had to finish uploading the last batch of surveillance data to the fleet." Professor Kell'tar made a sound that might have been a whimper. "Fleet?" "Oh yes," Rex replied with the kind of helpful tone that people used when explaining obvious things to confused children. "We've had a monitoring squadron positioned just outside the system for the past 3 months. Standard protocol when conducting deep intelligence operations in potentially hostile territory." Maya nodded approvingly. "How did the final assessments turn out, Captain?" "Better than expected, honestly," Rex said, pulling out his own device and projecting a star chart that showed the positions of what appeared to be a significant military force. "Turns out most galactic defense networks are designed to repel the kind of direct assault that primitive species might attempt. They're not really configured to handle asymmetric warfare, psychological operations, or coordinated multi-vector infiltration strategies." The blood drained from every alien face in the auditorium that possessed blood to drain. The others simply achieved various states of panic-induced color changes. "The economic disruption scenarios were particularly interesting," Rex continued conversationally. "Did you know that we could destabilize 70% of galactic trade routes simply by introducing uncertainty into 3 specific shipping calculation algorithms?" Apparently. Nobody planned for the possibility that someone might deliberately target logistics networks instead of military installations. "Captain," Maya said with mild reproach, "you're terrifying our hosts." "Am I?" Rex looked around the auditorium with genuine surprise, as if he hadn't noticed the widespread expressions of existential dread. "Oh, we're not actually planning to implement any of these strategies. This is purely theoretical analysis for defensive planning purposes." "Defensive?" Professor Kell'tar croaked. "Absolutely," Maya confirmed. "You see, Professor, humans have this interesting quirk. We like to be prepared for problems before they become actual problems. So when we joined Galactic Society, we naturally wanted to understand the strategic landscape we were entering. The thing about humans," Rex added helpfully, "is that we've spent our entire evolutionary history assuming that everything around us was probably trying to kill us. It makes us very thorough when it comes to threat assessment." The auditorium had achieved a level of silence that approached the absolute void of space. Professor Kell'tar sat slumped in his chair, his entire worldview having collapsed into rubble around him. So Maya concluded pleasantly, would anyone like to revise their assessment of human strategic capabilities? Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Nobody even seemed to be breathing. The predators had revealed themselves, and their prey finally understood exactly how outmatched they had always been. Maya gathered her notebook and pen with the same casual efficiency she had displayed throughout the lecture, while Rex checked something on his device that made him nod with satisfaction. "Well, this has been absolutely educational," Maya said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. "Thank you for such an illuminating presentation, Professor Kell'tar. Your insights into primitive predator behavior were truly enlightening." Professor Kell'tar didn't respond. He sat staring at his hands, his entire academic career reduced to a monument to intellectual arrogance and strategic blindness. "Oh, before I forget," Rex added, pausing at the auditorium entrance, "the intelligence assessment report will be forwarded to all relevant diplomatic channels within the week. Standard courtesy notification, you understand, no classified details. Just general observations about galactic security postures and potential areas for improved cooperation." Ambassador Nix Ra, who had remained frozen in horror throughout the entire exchange, finally found her voice. "Colonel Torres, Captain Montana, perhaps we should schedule some formal diplomatic discussions about mutual understanding and strategic cooperation." "Excellent idea," Maya replied warmly. "I'm sure our diplomatic corps would be delighted to establish better communication protocols. After all, humans are very interested in maintaining peaceful relationships with our galactic neighbors." The two humans walked out of the auditorium with the relaxed pace of people who had simply attended an interesting academic lecture. The door hissed shut behind them, leaving several hundred of the galaxy's most advanced species sitting in stunned silence. Professor Kell'tar's holographic projector was still running, displaying the frozen image of that primitive Earth grizzly bear. Its claws and fangs looked somehow less impressive now, relics of a crude evolutionary approach that paled in comparison to what real predators could accomplish. Because the most dangerous predators in the galaxy, it turned out, didn't need claws or fangs or acid breath or telepathic powers. They just needed patience, intelligence, and the psychological makeup to spend months or years studying their targets while pretending to be harmless. The galaxy had spent so much time congratulating itself on evolving beyond primitive violence that it had completely failed to recognize a species that had elevated violence to an art form, disguised it as diplomacy, and wrapped it in the kind of strategic thinking that could dismantle civilizations without firing a single shot. Somewhere in the back of the auditorium, a crystalloid engineer whispered the question that everyone was thinking, what have we gotten ourselves into? Nobody had an answer. But they were all suddenly very, very interested in being humanity's friend.